Chris Ballard has spoken for the final time before next week's 2024 NFL Draft, and we are reading the tea leaves. Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Colts, your daily Indianapolis Colts podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right. Thanks for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day. This is your daily podcast covering your Indianapolis Colts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's show is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I admit it, I have a competitive side, which is a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So just join your friends and download Monopoly Go now, free on the App Store or Google Play. What's up, friends and family? This is Jake Arthur and Zach Hicks of horseshoehuddle.com. And today we are digesting Chris Ballard's pre-draft press conference and giving it back to you how we see it. You know, GMs obviously cannot tell you the truth or tell you straightly what they're going to do in the draft. But Chris, I feel like is always as transparent as he can be. And if you look back at his pre-draft press conferences over the last few years, there's little bits of accuracy in there and things you can kind of take away. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to break this into three kind of main points. One is that we think there's a good chance that they're going to trade back. We also do think that if they are going to trade up, it's not something they're just going to deliberately go into the draft thinking about. It's going to be if someone is starting to slide that they really, really covet and isn't too far ahead, like they're just a little bit out of reach and they think trading up a little bit could get them there. And then finally, now this was something that he was probably most coy about today, but the cap space generated from DeForest Buckner's contract extension, what that means, because he said, it gives them flexibility. Sure, but why? They kind of did something a little out of character for themselves. So Zach, I'm just going to throw out a couple main points here before we, a couple main little nuggets here before we dive in to the trading back part. Just some little tiny pieces that I noticed. And if you want to chime in on these or add in your own, let's do it. So football character versus off-field character. So in this one, we're kind of starting to see now where they're willing to play ball a little bit more with these guys. And even as well as Drew Ogletree coming off the commissioner's exempt list, he's back with the team. Feels like nothing ever happened, right? So there's a couple guys in this draft that do have some questions of off-field stuff. And if it's something in terms of them just being young and dumb, that's one thing. But if it's something that's going to cause any sort of problem in the locker room or, their work ethic is a question, not happening. So let's just throw that out there now. I don't think defensive back is an enormous priority. Every opportunity given, Chris Ballard seems to defend who they have. And that kind of goes against a lot of what we've talked about all offseason. Chris really loves the wide receiver and offensive line depth throughout the draft. So that means if it's not done early, which offensive line doesn't need to be done early, but it doesn't mean they won't do it maybe even multiple times throughout later in the draft. Drafting for future needs is kind of a tug of war they talked about a little bit between the personnel staff and the coaching staff. Coaches obviously want guys who can contribute now. And then the scouting department, they're more willing to take guys who might need to develop a little longer. The draft is loaded on offense, particularly early in the draft. And then finally, the Colts have about 19 to 21 first-round grades on players, which obviously that's when we start to get into the discussion of trading back. And Zach, I saw you quote tweet one of my tweets from when I was reporting during there. So go ahead and tell us what you think.
Yeah, that was funny. No, all the mentions of trading back and then specifically saying 19 to 21 first round grades. I thought all those things were really interesting because it felt like kind of a nod to the GMs of those teams, especially in that 19 to 21 range where it's like, hey, we're open for business. Come on up. Hey, Steelers at 20. You want an offensive tackle? we want to trade back. I mentioned it 12 times or whatever in my press conference. Come on up, baby. Come on. Give me a 3rd round pick. Let's play ball. And I can get a player that I like there in the 20s. But yeah, I mean, obviously all the stuff you mentioned there, I don't want to just gloss over it. We can talk about that in depth as well too. But going to the trade back thing, it was really funny. You texted me right after the press conference and you were like, hey, it seems like the Colts are definitely going to trade back. And I was like, okay, maybe he was being coy with some things and kind of hinting at it. But then I read the transcript and it was like 3 or 4 times where he was like, I can already see the articles when we trade back, obviously want to gain more picks. Obviously we want to move back. And I'm like, oh, he legit just said multiple times, hey, I want to trade back. So yeah, I mean, look, I said it the other day on the show. I'm always team trade back early or, whenever, because I like to have more shots at the board. And Chris Ballard actually said that exactly in this press conference. He said, trading back in this business gives you more shots at the board, which gives you a better chance at finding those gems and those hits. And it also covers up for your misses when you miss early in the draft on guys. So I'm team trade back. I like the idea in this draft to trade back unless someone falls to 15 that they feel like is a legit blue chip player. And I think it's good business. So again, I know our comment section and those articles like Ballard has mentioned are going to be just ripping it apart and stuff, but he was not mincing his words when talking about trading back, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and in terms of specifics, what they might trade back for, again, we talked about offense in this one. Chris thinks it's pretty loaded up front. There's an interesting quote, and I've got the whole thing here, but to just basically boil it down, they were recently, the scouting department is kind of moving forward with more chats with the coaching staff about getting final thoughts and how you can use this player and this player. Chris mentioned, there was a little bit of a discussion. He wouldn't say offense or defense, but they were talking about 2 players, and specifically everybody's got flaws, but what can you do with the abilities of these 2 players? And it was good to see the coaching staff have plans for everybody. And I've seen already several people mention, Brian Thomas Jr. and Xavier Worthy. That might be a pretty decent discussion that they're having, and very possible one. Now, I think most places, at least online, Thomas is rated higher. He's obviously bigger. He has similar athleticism. But for the Colts, I can imagine Worthy might be in that same tier. What do you think? Do you think that might be a legit discussion? Could they be those 2 players that he was talking about?
Potentially. Let me read the quote because you have it right here. Let me just read the little part of the quote that we're really focusing on here. He said, and I quote, "We're meeting with our coaches today and tomorrow, and we just had a long discussion about a couple guys. I'm not going to tell you what side of the ball, but what's the vision for the player? Like, it's easy for scouts and us to have a vision, but the coaches have to have the same vision," end quote right there. That's what Ballard said in his press conference. Now, obviously, he could be talking about defensive players. He could be talking about a Cooper DeJean, safety or corner, a Dallas Turner, where, you could do some off-ball stuff with him as well. But I think we all kind of know he's talking offense there. He's almost certainly talking offense. And while I do think a guy like Brock Bowers kind of fits into that as well, I think this mainly looks at wide receiver. And when you're looking at 2 guys who are very flawed prospects, Brian Thomas Jr. and Xavier Worthy, very, very flawed guys. They're not guys who are going to be complete receivers from day one, but they each have that elite trait. And that's kind of where this whole tangent even started in this conversation with Ballard. He was talking about guys having their strengths and weaknesses. And he says, again, and I quote here, "This is what he does really well. Let's put him in a role to do that specific thing really, really well." And I wrote about Brian Thomas Jr. today in an article where I was saying, look, Brian Thomas Jr. might only do one thing really well, but that one thing he does really well is so insanely valuable to an offense that it might push him up aboard of a team like the Colts, because he honestly has the potential to be one of the best vertical threats in the entire league. You look at Xavier Worthy's ability to stop and start, his next level speed, just his fluidity throughout everything he does, and just the level of athlete he is so insanely rare that, again, it's kind of the scouting like, okay, we're getting this insanely rare athlete who has legit gravity no matter what we're doing with him. I think we can work with that. Like, what role would you have him in to work? So I think when I'm looking at that quote, I'm thinking, who are the two or three players, whatever it is that they're talking about, those are the first 2 guys to come to mind, because they are so niche driven from day one. They need a specific role from day one, and they're going to help your team from day one, but it's not going to be in like this all around role. It's going to be in that one little niche setting, and then you can grow it from there and hopefully get them to be, the players that you want to be. They're both going to be 21 for their rookie seasons, so they're still really young players. But I did think that quote was really interesting because it's kind of how I view it. Like when I'm looking at these two players in particular, I'm thinking from day one, I'm getting one elite trait. How does that stack up against someone like a Jalen Polk, for instance, or a Ricky Pearsall, where I'm getting a really solid player across the board, but I don't have an elite trait with those guys. Maybe Pearsall's hands are pretty elite, but you know what I mean? Like I'm not getting that elite trait, but these two guys, I am getting something that I can't find in anybody else with the deep threat ability and just the overall athleticism. And if I trust my coaching staff to use that correctly, I can have an advantage over the competition. So I did love that conversation piece there from Ballard where, you're talking about seeing what a guy can do versus what they can't do. And if they can do something that nobody else can do or only very few people can do, that has a lot of value in the draft.
Yeah, and I think that's huge because even talking to Shane on Monday, he's a lot more involved in the process now. The staff is altogether because I think I asked him this question on Monday. This time last year, they were installing the offense. They were doing this and that. They were doing coaching things because they had to get ready to get the guys in the building and establish themselves. But now that's all that's done. Like they are trying to focus partly on the draft and letting the personnel department know what types of players they want, what they can do with them. So that they are a lot more involved. And those are the discussions they're having now. And I'm glad you mentioned DeJean because I was kind of thinking Terry and Arnold, Cooper DeJean, players with similar multi-skilled backgrounds. But, if you're looking one offense, one defense, that's kind of what I would say. But we're going to go ahead in a minute and talk about the possibility of trading up and what we think that might take for them to trade up, which is the opposite of what we just said. Today's show is made possible with the help of sponsors like Yahoo Finance. Wouldn't it be great if you could see all of your investment and retirement accounts in one place? With Yahoo Finance, you can consolidate your views from multiple accounts into one hub and access the expert analysis you need to tend to your entire portfolio with confidence. Let's just get straight to the point. You want to grow your portfolio to deal with the rising costs of inflation, to pay off your debt or your mortgage, pretty much anything standing in the way of you and financial freedom, right? Well, with Yahoo Finance, you can get access to the news, data, and tools that you need in order to help reach that financial freedom. When it comes to your financial future, you think you've done it all. You've saved, you've researched, you've invested all that you can, but now you need to take those investments to the next level by using what every financial great uses, and that's Yahoo Finance. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Whether you're a seasoned investor or you're looking for that extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data that you need in one place. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com, the number one financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com. All right, so let's talk about the less likely scenario, Zach, and that is moving up. Chris used what I thought was an interesting phrase when talking about this. He said, if a player is in striking distance. And to me, that means kind of like, I'm going to use Jonathan Taylor in 2020 as an example. The Colts were on the clock at like 44, 46, and he was there at 41. So not a great deal ahead of him, just like 5 spots. And that's striking distance. They said they could do it. They could afford the draft capital, go up and do it. I think that's what we'll see in this instance if they are to trade up. If there's a player, I've got here, I think I named 5 guys who I think might be like horseshoe guys in this draft. Marvin Harrison Jr., Rome Odunze, Brock Bowers, Dallas Turner, Quinyon Mitchell. Now, some of those guys aren't top 10 locks. Like they may be fine for the Colts to get at 15. But it's players who I could see the Colts being in love with that they start to sweat, if it's getting closer and they have the opportunity to go ahead and secure them. So striking distance, those guys are there at 10, 11, 12. They're just a few picks away, and all it's going to cost the Colts is like a 3rd round pick. I think that is the scenario. And just kind of looking at a couple other nuggets throughout Chris's presser, he talked a lot about protecting Anthony, but also adding playmakers for him. and a couple of those guys, Harrison and Dunze Bowers, that really fits the bill. Athletic freaks, which you can't just always get throughout the draft. That was mostly talking about the longevity of players. And obviously you want players that can do really good things for you, but if they can do that and play in the league for a dozen years, then that's all the better. So I think if the Colts have some of these guys circled and it starts getting closer, I think it's possible they might make a move. It's definitely the more uncharacteristic of the two for them.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors that come into play here, and there's just a lot of factors I don't think that lead to the Colts potentially trading up in this draft. One being the striking distance comment there. I mean, I think that officially throws out the whole Colts are trading up to 4 or 5. Jim Irsay is going to come in, kick
Way
the door
far.
down, and
Too
scream,
far.
we have to trade up to number 4 or something. Like, that's not going to happen. And if we look at Chris Ballard's draft history with the Colts, he's only made 2 trade ups in the first 2 rounds in his entire GM history with this team. And the most picks he's moved up is 3 picks. 3 picks is the most he's moved up. 44 to 41 for Jonathan Taylor. And I want to say it was 67 to 64 for Tyquan Lewis in 2018. So he has not moved up very far. And it's kind of like what you're saying, where it's that striking distance where it's like, hey, we really like this player. We only really have to give up like an extra 4th rounder to get him. And we can jump the one team that could stop him from getting to us. That's the only situation. And that player has to be somebody who checks every athletic box, who checks every single character box they have, checks every, all these things that they look for in the pre-draft process. Because again, when you are drafting a player in the NFL draft, you're giving up a valuable asset. I mean, the picks, like if you're using a 1st round pick on a player, you're essentially saying we are valuing you the same as we would, like 15 in this draft, the same they would at DeForest Buckner trade, because DeForest Buckner was traded for the 13th overall pick that the Colts had. Like they're valuing you at that level on a cheap contract for the next 4 to 5 years. So it's immensely valuable to take a player with that 1st round pick, but to also give up more selections as well. And sacrificing those other cheap contracts to get this player, they're saying that we have to be fully committed to that. And even when you look at the players in this draft, like I think they would take Bowers at 15. I think they would take Marvin Harrison Jr. at 15. But are you going to trade up for a player who maybe didn't work out the whole pre-draft process, for a guy who maybe didn't do the interviews with you or something, or didn't do interviews well even? I'm not saying that any of these guys fall to that. Like, it has to be a guy who checks every single box, from competitiveness to again, the medicals have to check off, the athleticism has to check off. For me, it's only Rome Odunze and Dallas Turner that really check that box in terms of trading up. And again, I'm not saying these other guys don't check every box. I'm just saying that those guys we have seen throughout this process have done every single little thing that the Colts value in the pre-draft process. So
I'd say Mitchell too, but you could get him at 15 maybe.
Yeah, that one is more so Chris Ballard's relationship with cornerback position. I don't know if he's someone who believes in trading up for that position, where I could see a difference maker on offense or an edge rusher being a little bit more value in his mind. But I could see a Quinyon Mitchell too. He's been great this whole pre-draft process. But yeah, it's something where I don't believe it's in his bones much. And I think if we were talking about going up much at all, it would be to like pick 13 at the earliest, like maybe one pick up to pick 14 just to secure a player where he's giving up like a 5th round pick to do it. Outside of that, I think he's going to let the board come to him. He's going to evaluate his options at 15, and then he's going to look around and say, okay, what are other people offering me? Can I get the guy I want at 20 or 21 or whatever it's going to be? But I just don't see the trade up happening. And I feel like a lot of what he said today kind of further back that up.
Yeah, and honestly, I think if you're looking to trade up, and like you mentioned, it's happened in the first couple rounds sparingly, it probably would be more likely in the 2nd round this year. I think going up again from 46, you see someone at 41, 2, 3 there. Like there are a few guys who could fall a little bit, but probably not drastically. But again, he talked about this being a loaded offensive draft, which is going to push some talented defensive players down a little bit. So you could absolutely see that. It doesn't mean it has to be 1st round. It could be some guy in the 2nd round who has some 1st round consideration from a lot of people online or even teams that we're just not even really mentioning. But I mean, it doesn't mean they won't get aggressive. And we've seen it throughout the draft. Kari Willis was 4th round, I think. I think there was a Nick Cross, 3rd round. So like they're willing to do it within the first few rounds. It just doesn't happen a ton. So
Yeah. No, and my big thing to add with that too is I feel like because we all get so involved in draft season, we all watch all the film, we listen to the Mel Kipers and Dane Bruglers of the world, and really get involved with how we personally rate these guys on film. But at the end of the day, where a player gets taken doesn't mean that they're automatically going to be that level of impact. Taking a guy at number 9, for instance, doesn't guarantee them to be better than, the 15th overall guy taken. I mean, the best rookie in football last year was taken in round 5. And I know that's a major outlier, but that was the best overall rookie in the entire league. I mean, him and CJ Stroud, who was taken 2nd, but the other one was taken in round 5, and that's Puka Nacua. The best wide receiver in the league was taken in the 20s by the Vikings after they traded Stephon Diggs away. I mean, Justin Jefferson was taken in the mid-20s. Like these receivers or whoever you're taking, it doesn't mean that they're automatically going to be superstars when they're taking the top 10. Like, yes, it's a better lottery chance of them panning out if you are picking that high, but it doesn't always guarantee it. I mean, we've seen a lot of players miss and bust from wherever they're taken. So just because the Colts aren't trading up, for instance, in the draft, doesn't mean that they're not trying to add a difference maker. Difference makers can come at any different part of the draft. It's maybe more likely that one in the top 10 will pan out, but again, it more likely might be a 15% chance of working compared to a 13% chance of working, so again, it's not the end of the world. They don't trade up. It doesn't mean they're not adding a difference maker, because difference makers are found everywhere in the NFL draft. But coming up, we're going to continue this conversation. We're going to move a little bit past the draft and talk about the cap space that the Colts created with DeForest Buckner and how Chris Ballard was active on Twitter the second that he made that move. But first, we've all been there, either as a player or a fan. It's halftime and the scoreboard is not looking good. You're feeling low, not sure you or your team can pull out a win, and that's when you dig deep, lift your head up, and say to yourself, time to get back in the game, pull off some bank heist, and take as much of my friend's money as I possibly can. Personally, I don't know if that's ever been me. My wife, most competitive person that's ever existed, and one of her favorite games in the entire world is Monopoly Go. It lets you compete with your friends or your husband in this situation to get the most riches and the biggest empire. It's the Monopoly that you love, but on your phone anytime, with tons of new twists, including your leaderboards to compare your progress to your buddies. There's so much to do. Play on countless dynamic Monopoly boards. Make your friends, aka me, again, if we're talking from my wife's perspective, bankrupt by smashing their landmarks with a wrecking ball. Charge other players rent for iconic properties. You can even work with your friends to crack open community chests and in tournaments to get extra rewards and climb the leaderboard. So get back out there, put on your game face, and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. All right, Jake, we're talking post-draft now. The Indianapolis Colts are looking at quite a bit of cap space, and that was made because of the way they structured the DeForest Buckner extension. We all went crazy the second it happened, like, oh my gosh, a big move is coming. They're going to trade for Brandon Ayuk and sign Justin Simmons and somehow, scoop up Pat Mahomes from the Chiefs. Like, they're going to just do all this stuff because cap space equals everything. But to go away from the sarcasm here, they do have $28 million in cap space now. And it's at a late point in free agency where even in factoring in what they're going to do in the draft, they're going to have plenty of space afterwards. I mean, unless they're moving up to picks 1, 2, and 3, they can still use plenty of cap space after the draft here. And I think for me, I have a theory about why they're doing this, but you were at the press conference today. What did Chris Ballard say when in regards to that cap space they created?
No, he just joked that it was to see Twitter go nuts, and then after the joking had subsided, it was basically, what does it just give you flexibility? And he said yes. So sure, and it can roll into next year because they've got a lot of guys to re-sign next year, like they did this year. But for me, I think it's mostly to give them the flexibility to free up to make moves in free agency after the draft by maybe filling some spots that they just didn't get to during the draft. You could go in planning to, hopefully get a corner or someone like that. But if you don't, now you have the flexibility to get a decent player out on the market. Same with safety. I mean, Julian Blackmon has really come into his own as a strong safety. If you want to keep him there, there's a few free safeties on the open market that you might have to pay a little penny for, but now you have that financial freedom to do so.
Yeah, I mean, look, you guys know me. Throughout the whole free agency process, I was saying, look, this is how the Colts are. We just know that Chris Ballard does not attack free agency like some other GMs out there. But I don't know. There's something different about this move. And Chris Ballard kind of like, yes, he played it off as a joke originally. And then it took like a very direct question for him just to kind of be like, yeah, like for him to even answer on it. So he's being really coy about something that he doesn't really need to be coy about. Like if he really was committed to rolling this into next year, he would have said, yeah, we're doing that to roll into next year. We have some other guys that we want to extend, but he didn't. I mean, in a press conference where he was very open about wanting to trade back, about wanting to add to the offensive line and adding to wide receiver, he was very quiet about this, like it was joking around and then kind of shrugging it off. So I really do think, and this is, again, maybe me reading too much into it. You guys can let us know in the comments section, but I think this move was made to bring in veterans at either, and however you want to look at it, it could be a safety and or corner after the draft, because they want to go pass catcher in the first two picks, like one of the first two picks. I don't, maybe not both, but I think they want to go pass catcher early. I think they want to add more dynamicism to this offense, get that dynamic ability at wide receiver, or maybe tight end with a certain player we've mentioned a lot. And then that way, after the draft, they can address like, hey, we still need a starting free safety. Maybe we still want a veteran at corner. So they can go out and get a Justin Simmons at $15 million a year. And then as well as a Steven Nelson at like $4 million a year. Like those are doable deals. I'm not saying that's exactly what the contract's going to be, and those are the two guys they're going after. But this kind of cap space isn't just created for no reason. Like you mentioned, they could roll it in the next season, but you just would have cut Buckner's cap hit for next season if you're going to do that.
Right.
If you didn't plan on using this money now, you just would have front loaded everything, eaten as much cap space as you could this year because you had it available, and then you could have been more flexible in the future. There's no point in making cap space for now just to carry it into next season. There's no point in that. So I think this indication for me, and you can add on to this too here, Jake. I think the indication for me is we've decided we want to go pass catcher. Most likely, again, I'm not saying that it's all set in stone. It comes down to how the board falls, but I think they want to go pass catcher with one or two of their first two picks. And to do that, they need the flexibility to get a safety after the draft. So they needed to make that flexibility with cap space. And now they feel comfortable enough with where their roster is and where the market's at to where they can go get their pass catcher in round one or round two if they need to.
I agree. I'm pretty sold. Again, you and I were kind of talking off air before this. Just everything I have rewatched and reread that Chris has said since the season ended to now, I just really think this is about Anthony and building around him and giving him playmakers and making sure the offense is taken care of. Because let's just take like the Texans, for example. They obviously are full in on CJ Stroud. You could build a nice defense to combat that. But like in the NFL, I think you need to fight fire with fire. Like they are pretty sold on Anthony. They're going to surround him with talent. And Chris does not miss an opportunity to complement the secondary they already have, especially the corners. Loves Dallas Flowers, loves Jalen Jones. And maybe they don't want to get some guy in the first round that they obviously have to commit to for 4 years. Like maybe they just want to get a Steven Nelson or a Witherspoon or something for a year and give a capable starting player for a year to throw into the mix. So I'm with you. I'm pretty sold that it's a playmaker on offense early, and they're willing to punt drafting a defensive back early because they now know they can get one. I mean, there are some good names, and I think a big reason these guys are still out there is because maybe even some of these guys have offers already, and they're just waiting to see what happens in the draft to make their decision on where's the best situation for them to go. Obviously, at free safety, you're looking at Justin Simmons, Quandre Diggs, Eddie Jackson. Corner, you got Xavier Howard, Steven Nelson, Akello Witherspoon, Jerry Jacobs is a decent one. Even like running back is something they have looked at in free agency. Like you got Cam Akers, who's still like in his mid-20s. Like, it seems like he's been in the league forever, but that's a guy who has starting experience who could back up Jonathan Taylor. I mean, he's not going to cost much, but like, you have this money available to give to some veterans out on the market after the draft.
Yeah. My big takeaway really is I think they're going pass catcher early. I know that's kind of the indication they've given a lot through this process, and I've kind of been earmuffs throughout all of it because I kept looking at corner, I kept looking at safety, maybe even defensive end. But when they made that move is when the light bulb kind of went over my head, and I was like, okay, that's weird. That's really weird, especially with guys available who are available. So I do think we're going to see pass catcher pretty early in this draft, but who knows? We'll talk about it more next week, obviously, when we're back here on the show. Before we get out of here, though, I do want to remind you guys the Indie Draft Guide is now here for $9.99. You can get access to an essential piece of reading for Colts fans, both before and after the draft, featuring 225 in-depth scouting reports, features, and much more. Click the link in our show notes to order today. And if you guys don't already, make sure that you are following at Locked On Colts, at Jake Arthur NFL, and at Zach Hicks2, all on Twitter. Also, subscribe to us on YouTube, wherever you listen to your podcast. We love your guys' ratings and views, and we'll see you guys back here with a special guest next week.